In the autumn of 1860, the American South was not a rebellion waiting to happen. It was an empire at the height of its confidence. Its currency was not gold or silver, but a soft white fiber that dressed the mills of Manchester, fed the looms of Lyon, and clothed a good portion of the industrialized world: cotton. By some counts, the fields stretching from the Carolinas to Texas supplied more than 3/4 of the raw fiber consumed by British industry, an industry that employed, directly or indirectly, close to 1/5 of the United Kingdom's population. Southern planters did not think of themselves as isolated agrarians clinging to a doomed institution. They thought of themselves as holding the trigger to the modern industrial world. If war came, and by 1860 many suspected it would, the calculation seemed almost mathematical. Cut off the cotton, and Britain's mills go silent within months. Cut off the cotton, and France's textile towns follow. Starve the looms, and the great powers of Europe will have no choice but to intervene on behalf of the men who grow the fiber. It was a theory with a name, King Cotton, and in the drawing rooms of Charleston and the Senate cloakrooms of Washington, otherwise cautious men spoke of it as settled fact. Cotton, they believed, was not simply a crop. It was leverage over the entire Atlantic economy. What none of them yet understood was that leverage, in finance as in diplomacy, only works if the other side believes you will actually pull the lever, and that somewhere in the counting houses of Paris and London, men who owed no loyalty to plantation or union were already doing very different arithmetic. The fall, when it came, would not begin on a battlefield. It would begin in a ledger. In March of 1863, a document went on sale in Paris and London that, on its face, made no sense at all. It was an ornate certificate, engraved with cotton bales and sailing ships, promising the bearer repayment not merely in currency but in raw cotton itself, delivered at a fixed and highly favorable price once the war ended. The nation issuing it was the Confederate States of America, a government recognized by not one single foreign power on earth. No embassy, no treaty, no seat at any table. And yet within days, European investors, from minor aristocrats to shopkeepers with modest savings, rushed to buy in. The bond would come to be known in later economic histories simply as the Erlanger loan, after the Frankfurt-born banking house that structured it. It raised, on paper, $15 million for a government that could not guarantee its own survival past the next harvest. Historians still argue about who actually profited, who was deceived, and whether the man who arranged it even believed the Confederacy would win. So the question worth asking is this: why would the hardest-nosed financiers in Europe stake a fortune on a country that didn't officially exist? And what did they know that the men fighting and dying for that country did not? To understand how deep the leverage ran, it helps to look at the numbers few textbooks bother to print. In 1860, the United States federal government carried a national debt of roughly $65 million, a rounding error by modern standards, manageable even then. Cotton alone accounted for close to 60% of all American exports that year, more than every other export commodity combined. The South, with a fraction of the nation's white population, produced the commodity that effectively financed America's entire relationship with the outside world. Confidence in that arrangement had been reinforced only 3 years earlier, in the Panic of 1857, when railroad speculation and a collapsing grain market gutted northern banks and stock exchanges, while cotton prices, propped up by steady British demand, barely flinched. Southern newspapers took note. If the North's paper economy could collapse in a season, and the South's cotton economy could not, then perhaps, the thinking went, the South did not need the Union nearly as much as the Union needed the South. Then the war came, and the arithmetic on both sides began to move in directions nobody in 1860 had modeled. Between 1861 and 1865, the Union government's debt exploded from that $65 million baseline to roughly $2.7 billion, a more than 40-fold increase in 4 years. Measured per person, the federal debt burden on every man, woman, and child in the Union rose from a little over $2 in 1860 to more than $75 by 1865, a figure the country would not see matched again until the First World War, half a century later. To manage that kind of borrowing, the Lincoln administration and Congress built financial machinery from scratch. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 authorized the printing of paper currency, the famous greenbacks, not backed by gold but by government promise alone, eventually totaling around $450 million in circulation. The National Banking Act of 1863 went further still, creating a new class of federally chartered banks, required to back their currency with United States government bonds, which had the convenient side effect of manufacturing a captive market for Union war debt almost overnight. It was, in effect, a machine that turned patriotism and self-interest into the same transaction. The Confederacy had no comparable machine, and the gap showed almost immediately. Without a functioning national bank, without meaningful gold reserves, and increasingly without ports to trade through, the Confederate Treasury leaned overwhelmingly on the printing press. Confederate paper currency in circulation ballooned into the hundreds of millions of dollars by the war's final year, and prices in the Confederate interior did not simply rise, they detonated. By the estimate of the historian Douglas Ball, cumulative wartime inflation inside the Confederacy exceeded 9,000%. By the time the guns fell silent in 1865, the cost of ordinary goods in the South stood at roughly 92 times what it had been before the war began. Union inflation over the same period, by comparison, ran closer to 80%, painful but survivable. This is the number rarely mentioned in classroom summaries of the war. The Confederacy did not just lose on the battlefield. Its money became worthless, more than 100 times faster than its opponents. Into that gap stepped foreign finance. Cotton, still the Confederacy's one genuinely valuable export, became the collateral of last resort. And this is where men like Judah Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of State, and John Slidell, its commissioner in Paris, began looking not to Richmond or to Washington, but to the banking houses of Europe. The result in 1863 was the Erlanger loan, $15 million authorized in principal, though after underwriting fees, commissions, and a market price set below face value from the outset, the Confederacy actually received something closer to $8.5 million in real usable funds, less than 60 cents on the dollar, for a war that by then was consuming well over $1 million a day in Confederate resources to sustain. It was on paper a financial lifeline. In practice, it barely covered a few weeks of the war's true cost, and it came with strings that nobody back in Richmond had fully priced in. To understand why a man like Judah Benjamin ended up brokering a bond deal in Paris rather than sitting quietly in a Richmond legislature, it helps to go back to where he started. Benjamin was born in 1811 on the island of St. Croix in the Danish West Indies to a family of Sephardic Jewish merchants, who later settled in Charleston and then New Orleans. He was, by nearly every account, formidably intelligent, enrolled at Yale at 14, though he left before graduating amid circumstances his biographers still debate, some pointing to financial hardship, others to a scandal the record never fully clarifies. Either way, he arrived in Louisiana with little but his own ability and rebuilt himself from scratch, first as a law clerk, then a practicing attorney, then a sugar planter, and finally a United States senator, becoming by the 1850s one of the most respected legal minds in the country, and notably the first person of openly Jewish faith to sit in the United States Senate. He was not a natural revolutionary. He was a pragmatist, a courtroom tactician, a man reportedly so composed under pressure that colleagues who despised his politics still sought his counsel, a man who read a room before he spoke in it. When Louisiana seceded, Benjamin followed, and Jefferson Davis moved him rapidly through the Confederate cabinet, first as Attorney General, then Secretary of War, then, by 1862, Secretary of State. The wartime posting was not without controversy. As Secretary of War, he was blamed publicly for military supply failures that were arguably beyond his control, and he absorbed the criticism without public complaint, a pattern that would repeat throughout his career. Contemporaries called him, half admiringly and half suspiciously, the brains of the Confederacy. It was Benjamin who understood, earlier than most of his colleagues, that the Confederacy's survival depended less on Southern valor than on European capital, and who pushed hardest for the financial gambit that became the Erlanger loan. He corresponded directly with Slidell in Paris, weighed the terms, and accepted a deal that even some in his own government privately considered a poor one. Because the alternative was worse, no money at all. Benjamin's instincts about finance, as it turned out, outlasted the Confederacy itself. When Richmond fell in 1865, he fled, disguised by some accounts as a farmer, through Florida and the Caribbean, eventually reaching England. There, remarkably, he built a second successful legal career from nothing, rising to become one of the most sought-after barristers in the country and earning the rank of Queen's Counsel. He never wrote a memoir. He reportedly burned his personal papers. The man who had done more than almost anyone to finance a war for the survival of slavery spent his final decades as a celebrated figure in the courts of an empire whose neutrality he had once tried so hard to purchase. The room where the deal actually took shape was not in Richmond. It was in the Paris offices of Émile Erlanger Etier in the closing months of 1862 and the opening weeks of 1863. On one side sat Frédéric Émile d'Erlanger, the ambitious young head of a rising banking house, eager to establish his firm's name on the same tier as the Rothschilds and the Barings. On the other sat John Slidell, the Confederacy's chief commissioner to France, a former United States senator turned diplomat whose government had, by that point, gone more than a year without a single line of trade credit anywhere in Europe. Slidell needed money more than he needed favorable terms, and Erlanger appears to have understood that leverage perfectly. The terms agreed upon in January and finalized by March were straightforward in principle and brutal in practice. The Confederacy authorized a loan of up to £3 million sterling, roughly $15 million, issued as bonds convertible into cotton at 6 pence a pound, a price so favorable to the bondholder, given wartime cotton scarcity in Europe, that even cautious investors found it hard to resist. In exchange, the bonds were sold to the public at 90% of face value, meaning Erlanger's syndicate was already buying at a discount before a single coupon changed hands. On top of that discount, Erlanger's firm collected a 5% commission on every bond it placed, plus an additional 1% commission on every future interest and principal payment made to investors for the life of the loan. Correspondence back to Richmond from Confederate officials makes clear that some in the government understood exactly how much was being surrendered in fees alone and objected on the record. Secretary Benjamin's position, in substance, was that a discounted loan in hand was worth more than a full-value loan that never materialized. The Confederacy needed cash within weeks, not vindication in a negotiating room. The agreement was signed, and the prospectus went public on the 19th of March, 1863. Within days, the offering was oversubscribed several times over across London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. A rush of ordinary European investors, betting their savings on a country that, on every official map, in every foreign ministry on the continent, did not officially exist. While Slidell and Derlinger were finalizing terms in Paris, an entirely different kind of financier was building an entirely different kind of machine 3,000 miles away. In Philadelphia, and for most of the war, the two men never had any reason to think about each other at all. His name was J. Cook, and unlike Derlinger, he was not selling to European aristocrats or continental speculators. He was selling to farmers, shopkeepers, schoolteachers, and clerks, ordinary citizens of the Union who had never in their lives owned a government bond, and in most cases had no clear idea what one even was. Cook had started modestly as a clerk in a Philadelphia banking house before founding his own firm in 1861, and he arrived at his moment almost by accident, an earnest, deeply religious Ohio-born banker who happened to have a genius for something no one had thought to professionalize before, selling government debt to people who had never bought anything more complicated than a plow. In 1862, Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase handed Cook's firm the job of moving $500 million in newly authorized war bonds, paying 6% interest in gold and maturing over 5 to 20 years. Instruments that came to be known simply as the 520s. Cook built an advertising and distribution network from scratch, roughly 2,500 sales agents fanned out across northern towns and cities, backed by newspaper advertisements that framed buying a war bond not as an investment, but as a patriotic act. A stake in the nation's survival available in denominations as low as $50, cheap enough for a factory worker, not just a merchant. Ohio Senator John Sherman, watching the campaign unfold, later remarked that Cook had put the virtues of these bonds squarely in front of ordinary households from Maine to California, and it was not much of an exaggeration. Over the following 2 years, Cook's firm sold more than $511 million of those bonds. By early 1865, on the strength of that success, Congress authorized an even larger issue, $830 million, and Cook sold that too. By the war's end, something close to 1 million northern households, close to a quarter of all families in the Union, held a direct financial stake in its survival, a scale of public participation in war financing that no government anywhere had managed before. This is the detail that rarely makes it into the story. The Union did not simply outspend the Confederacy. It outfinanced it, structurally, by turning millions of ordinary citizens into creditors of their own government, people with a very personal reason to want that government and its debts to remain solvent. Where Derlinger sold the Confederacy's future to a relatively narrow circle of European speculators, betting on a war's outcome from a safe distance, Cook sold the Union's future to the people actually living inside it. Two philosophies of war finance developing in parallel, an ocean apart, neither man paying the other much mind. One of them was building a debt that the United States would spend the next 3 decades paying off, but paying off in full, on schedule, in gold. The other was building a debt that would not survive the war that created it. Neither man, in 1863, had any way of knowing which strategy would be remembered as visionary, and which would be remembered as a cautionary tale. Here is where the story bends back on itself. The entire premise behind King Cotton diplomacy, the theory that Britain and France would be forced to intervene once their mills ran dry, had already begun collapsing before the Erlanger loan was ever proposed. In the war's first year, Confederate leaders and planters, confident in their leverage, had voluntarily withheld cotton from export, an informal embargo meant to starve European industry into recognition. It was, in hindsight, one of the more consequential miscalculations of the entire war. Rather than panicking, British and French textile interests spent 1861 and 1862 aggressively expanding cotton imports from Egypt and India instead. By the time the Confederacy actually needed to monetize its cotton in 1863, through the Erlanger bonds, the scarcity it was counting on had already been substantially engineered away by its own government's earlier decision. The lever the South believed it was holding had been quietly disconnected from the machine, and official recognition, the entire point of the diplomatic pressure campaign, never came. Not from Britain, not from France, not from a single government on earth, not in 1861, not in 1863, not ever. Investors were not, in the end, buying a stake in a recognized nation. They were buying a bet on a rebellion's outcome. dressed up in the paper of cotton and sovereignty, which brings the story back to that room on the Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin. Because, whatever d'Erlanger privately believed about the Confederacy's odds, his firm's fee structure did not require the South to win. Erlanger collected his 5% commission the moment the bonds were placed, and his 1% on every subsequent payment, income that existed the moment the ink dried, independent of anything that happened afterward at Gettysburg or Vicksburg or anywhere else. The Confederacy absorbed the war risk. The bank absorbed almost none of it. And there is a final, almost novelistic detail historians rarely leave out once they find it. It was during this same period, the winter of 1862 into 1863, that d'Erlanger crossed paths with John Slidell's daughter, Matilda, the same young woman who, a year earlier, had been aboard the British mail steamer Trent when Union forces boarded it and seized her father, an incident that nearly dragged Britain into the war outright. D'Erlanger did not marry her, however, until October of 1864, more than a year after the loan had already been sold, after Gettysburg had already gutted its market value, after the Confederacy's fortunes had already turned unmistakably south. The alliance between banker and diplomat was not sealed in the flush optimism of early 1863. It was sealed after the money had already changed hands, after the profit had already been banked, when a Confederate victory was no longer the smart bet anyone serious was making. Read one way, it is simply a slow developing romance. Read another way, it looks very much like a financial house consolidating a relationship worth having, regardless of how the war it had profited from actually ended. When the Confederacy collapsed in April 1865, the reckoning for everyone involved arrived quickly, and it arrived unevenly. For the thousands of European investors who had bought Erlanger cotton bonds, minor nobility in England, shopkeepers in Amsterdam, provincial families in France who had been told they were investing in a nation on the verge of permanent independence, the bonds became worthless paper almost overnight. There would be no cotton delivered at 6 pence a pound. There would be no further interest, no principal, nothing. And there was no legal recourse whatsoever, because the same era that ended the war also moved to guarantee it. Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, explicitly declared that neither the United States nor any state would ever assume or pay any debt incurred in aid of rebellion, a single sentence that permanently erased the Confederacy's entire financial obligations, foreign and domestic alike. European bondholders spent years afterward petitioning and lobbying, all of it futile. Losses on Confederate cotton bonds ran into the tens of millions of dollars in period currency, absorbed almost entirely by private individuals who had believed, on the strength of a persuasive prospectus and a confident banking house, that they were backing the winning side of history. Erlanger's own firm, notably, did not share their fate. The commissions had already been collected. The house went on to become one of the more prominent private banks in Europe for the next half-century, later financing railways, government loans, and eventually a transatlantic telegraph cable. The same Erlanger name, still standing, long after the Confederacy it once financed had ceased to exist. There is a certain grim symmetry in that outcome. The institution built specifically to survive the war it financed did exactly that, while the nation it financed did not survive at all. Contrast that with what happened to Union credit over the same stretch of decades, having honored every dollar of its war debt, in gold, on schedule. The United States government emerged from the 1860s with a reputation for financial reliability it had never fully possessed before the war, a reputation that European and American investors alike would draw on for the rest of the century as Washington and Wall Street financed the railroads. Industry and infrastructure of the Gilded Age, reliability, it turned out, was a wartime asset with a very long shelf life. On the American side, the reckoning was measured in a different currency entirely. The most conservative estimates place Civil War deaths above 600,000. The historian J. David Hacker's more recent demographic analysis puts the true figure closer to 750,000. More American dead than nearly every other American war combined, before or since, up to that point. The Union's ability to keep fighting through 1864 and into 1865, through Cold Harbor, through the grinding siege of Petersburg, through months when battlefield momentum alone might not have sustained Northern political will, was underwritten in no small part by Jay Cook's bond machine, which kept converting civilian confidence into cash the government could spend on the next campaign. The Confederacy, by contrast, entered its final year functionally bankrupt, its currency worth a fraction of its face value, its treasury unable to reliably feed, clothe, or arm its own soldiers. Historians still debate how much longer the war might have dragged on, or how differently it might have ended, had the Confederacy's financial position simply held, and the debt itself did not disappear when the guns fell silent. The Union's debt took the United States government roughly 3 decades to substantially pay down, shaping federal tax and tariff policy well into the 1890s. The South's total repudiation, meanwhile, devastated what remained of Southern banking and credit for a generation, feeding directly into the sharecropping and tenant farming systems that would define the region's economy. and its racial hierarchy for the following 70 years. The war's financial architecture did not end at Appomattox. In many ways, it simply changed shape and kept working. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to walk away from a story like this and conclude that the Civil War was, at bottom, a banking dispute wearing the costume of a moral crusade, that men like Erlanger and Cook, not the men who actually debated secession, were the real authors of American history. That is not what the evidence supports, and it is worth saying plainly, the Confederacy itself did not claim to be fighting over tariffs or bond markets. Read the actual declarations of secession issued by South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas in early 1861, and the language is explicit, repeated, and unambiguous. The defense and expansion of slavery sits at the center of every one of them, stated as the primary and often sole justification for leaving the Union. Historians like Eric Foner and David Blight have spent careers documenting just how central that cause was, and nothing in the financial record undoes that. What the financial history adds is not a replacement for that cause, but a second layer beneath it, an explanation of mechanism rather than motive. Slavery explains why the war began. Cotton diplomacy, European bond markets, and the very different financing strategies pursued by Richmond and Washington go a long way toward explaining how long the war lasted, how it was fought, and ultimately why one side could sustain the fight and the other could not. Scholars of Confederate finance, from Douglas Ball's foundational work on Confederate financial failure onward, generally agree on this much. Southern financial strategy was improvised. Underfunded and structurally unsound almost from the outset, regardless of the moral case, either side believed itself to be making. That is a genuinely different claim from saying money caused the war. It is closer to saying that money decided, to a significant degree, how the war was allowed to end. And that is a distinction worth holding on to, rather than collapsing into a tidier, more cynical story than the evidence actually supports. There is a version of this story that is simply about the Confederacy, and there is a version that is about something older and considerably less comfortable. The fact that no cause, however righteous or however monstrous, fights its war without somebody, somewhere, keeping the books. The soldiers at Gettysburg did not know they were also fighting a bond market 3,000 miles away in Paris and Amsterdam. The European investors buying cotton certificates in 1863 were not thinking about the men who would die at Cold Harbor the following year. And Frederick-Émile d'Erlanger, signing commission agreements in a Paris office, was almost certainly not thinking in moral terms at all. He was thinking in percentages. That is perhaps the most unsettling continuity running underneath this entire story. Causes are fought by believers, but they are financed by people running a very different calculation. One that does not require them to believe in anything except the numbers in front of them. That gap between the people willing to die for a cause and the people merely willing to profit from it has never fully closed, in any war, in any century, including this one. It is worth sitting with that for a moment before moving on to the next video, because it is not really a story about the 1860s. It is a story about what happens every single time human conviction meets capital markets, and about how rarely those two forces are actually pulling in the same direction, however much they claim to be. If you made it this far, you already understand this channel is not interested in the version of history that fits on a bumper sticker. Comment the words "Cotton Bond" down below. If you want the next deep dive to go inside the ledgers of a different war entirely, there are others, and most of them are stranger than this one. And if this is the kind of history you don't get taught in school, the kind with real numbers, real names, and real consequences, subscribe, because there is considerably more where this came from.